It's a crisp, moonless night deep in the heart of a vast forest. The kind of night where even the trees seem to hold their breath. Far from the safety of civilization, a lone camper, unaware of the danger closing in, sets up camp. The only sounds are the crackling of the campfire and the distant hoot of an owl. But as the night grows darker, a chilling sound cuts through the stillness, the unmistakable howl of a wolf. At first, it's distant, a single, lonely call echoing through the trees. But then there's another howl, and another, closer this time. Something isn't right. As the camper nervously stokes the fire, the temperature drops, and the forest becomes eerily quiet, save for the unsettling sound of feet padding in the underbrush. The crackling of the fire is suddenly drowned out by the growl of something far larger than any animal this camper has ever encountered. Panic starts to settle in as the howls grow louder, closer, now unmistakably surrounding the campsite. The camper grabs their flashlight, their hands shaking as they scan the darkness. What they see will haunt them forever. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appear just beyond the reach of the campfire's light, followed by another, and then another. The wolves, a pack of them, slowly begin to encircle the camper, their eyes gleaming with hunger and purpose. The camper can't move, frozen in terror as the creatures inch closer, their snarls growing louder with every passing second. What happens next is beyond belief, something the camper could never have imagined in their worst nightmares. In this moment of pure terror, the camper's life hangs in the balance. The wolves, now surrounding them completely, are a mere heartbeat away from attacking. But what happens next will leave you questioning everything. These wolves, predators by nature, may not be the real danger. No, something far darker is lurking in the shadows. Something far worse than the wolves themselves. The true horror is just beginning. What will happen to this camper? And why are the wolves behaving in such a terrifying way? Keep watching. What unfolds next will leave you in tears. The air feels thick, cold, and unnervingly still, as though the entire forest is holding its breath. The camper, wrapped in the warmth of the firelight, can feel the weight of the silence pressing against their chest, every crackle from the flames echoing louder than it should. Their eyes dart nervously around the dark, their heart pounding in their chest, aware of the impenetrable darkness that stretches beyond the light's reach. The trees stand like silent sentinels, their twisted branches creaking in the wind, whispering secrets that seem to vanish as soon as they're heard. The fire flickers, casting long, eerie shadows that stretch unnaturally across the ground. Each gust of wind sends a chill through the camper's body, but it's not just the cold that unsettles them. It's the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes are studying every move they make. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes sends their pulse into overdrive. Is it an animal, person, or something far worse? The camper's breath is shallow, their hand trembling as they clutch the flashlight, their thoughts racing in confusion and fear. They tell themselves it's nothing, just the sounds of the wild, but deep down, they know something is terribly wrong. The wolves, though they're not the only threat, there's something in the dark that even they fear. The howls, now growing closer and more frequent, are a warning, a sign that danger is imminent. But the camper's mind can't grasp what it could be. They feel small, isolated, completely at the mercy of whatever is waiting just beyond the firelight. The night feels alive, pulsating with something darker and more ancient. The forest is no longer just a backdrop. It's a living, breathing entity, full of secrets and threats, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to venture too deep. Ethan stood near the edge of the campfire, the warmth from the crackling flames battling against the cold, creeping into the deep woods. His rugged face, rough from years of exposure to the elements, looked lost in thought. At 33, he was a seasoned outdoorsman, a man used to being alone in the wilderness. His father, a survivalist and wilderness expert, had taught him everything he knew. But those lessons hadn't prepared Ethan for the emotional battles he faced. The sudden loss of his father a year ago had hit him hard. For Ethan, nature was both an escape and a reminder of what he had lost. He came here, to the mountains, to silence the pain, but it was always there, gnawing at him. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to handle any survival situation. Whether it was a snowstorm, a sudden downpour, or navigating through dense forests, he was calm, collected, and capable. But even he couldn't escape the weight of grief. Every night, he found himself staring at the stars, thinking about his father's sudden death. Had he done enough? Had he said enough? The isolation of the mountains only amplified those doubts. His internal conflict was becoming harder to ignore. On the outside, Ethan exuded confidence, but internally, the trauma was festering. He tried to bury it under the guise of strength, but it wasn't working. The peace he sought seemed further away than ever. Rachel, a woman in her late 20s, sat on the opposite side of the fire, trying her best to seem unfazed by the growing tension in the air. She wasn't accustomed to this kind of isolation. Unlike Ethan, Rachel wasn't a survivalist. She wasn't even comfortable camping. But after a toxic relationship that had drained her emotionally, she had decided to join Ethan on this trip. Rachel believed the time away from everything would help her clear her head. But in truth, she was still haunted by the lingering scars of her past. Her relationship had left her with trust issues and a deep sense of insecurity. She kept her emotions buried behind a facade of independence. She didn't want to lean on anyone again. Not even Ethan, who she had become somewhat close to over the course of their few trips together. Her emotions were tangled in knots, and though she tried to distract herself with the beauty of the wilderness, the isolation only made the memories of her past more real. "Are you all right?" Ethan's voice broke her thoughts. He looked at her with a mixture of concern and detachment, his rugged face unreadable. Rachel forced a smile, trying to hide her discomfort. "Yeah, just thinking about everything. Life." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything more. He knew better than to press. They had been on a few hikes together, but this was their first real camping trip, and he could tell something was off with her. She wasn't like the other adventurers he had met, someone who could put their past behind them. Rachel was clearly still carrying baggage, and he wondered if this trip was as much for her as it was for him. Despite their differences, there was an unspoken bond between them. They both understood pain, though in different ways. For Ethan, the wilderness had always been his safe space, a place to mourn and heal in solitude. For Rachel, it was a desperate attempt to escape the emotional chaos of her past. But as the night crept deeper, the unease grew between them. Rachel's eyes flickered nervously to the dark forest surrounding them, and Ethan's usually composed demeanor seemed to crack just a little. A feeling of something looming, something watching them, filled the air. The silence of the woods was too heavy. Rachel looked at Ethan, sensing the change in him. "Are we really alone out here?" Ethan didn't reply immediately. He knew that in the woods, nothing was ever truly alone. But he didn't want to admit that to her, not yet. The tension between them was palpable, both of them hiding something, both of them struggling to push their pasts into the shadows. But as the wolves began to growl in the distance, their fears, both internal and external, would soon collide in a terrifying way. They were no longer just fighting their inner demons. Something real and dangerous was closing in on them. As the night deepened, the air grew colder. The flickering light of the campfire cast dancing shadows on the trees, which seemed to stretch and twist into grotesque shapes. The ominous sounds of the wilderness crept in. A low hum of the wind, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant howl of wolves. But there was something different this time, something unsettling about the wolves' calls. They were getting closer. Ethan stood up abruptly, his eyes narrowing, scanning the edges of the forest. He had been camping here for years and knew the woods well, but tonight felt different. The wolves' howls had stopped being just a background noise. They were growing louder, more frequent. "Do you hear that?" Rachel asked quietly, her voice tinged with fear. She had been trying to maintain a calm demeanor, but the way the wolves' calls echoed through the trees unsettled her. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though something invisible was closing in around them. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was trying to make sense of the sound, trying to distinguish the howls from the usual night noises. But something was off. He could feel it in his gut. The wolves were closer than they should be, too close. And they weren't just howling, they were circling. "I think we should move," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "This isn't normal." Ethan shook his head, his face hardening. "No, we stay put. Wolves won't approach a campfire, especially one this big." Rachel didn't seem convinced, but she knew better than to argue with someone as experienced as Ethan in these situations. She trusted his judgment, at least for now. But deep inside, a gnawing unease was taking root. The woods had never felt so alive with danger before. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with the sound of paw steps. A quick glance at Ethan's face revealed a subtle shift. His confident exterior was crumbling. The wolves were close, too close. His mind raced, calculating their options. The fire was their only defense. But for how long? Wolves were cunning predators, capable of surrounding their prey silently, with precision. Ethan grabbed a heavy branch from the fire pit and held it in his hand like a makeshift weapon, his jaw set in determination. He had been in dangerous situations before, but none that had felt as personal, as much of a threat. This wasn't just about surviving the wilderness. This was something else, something darker. The wind howled louder, and then there was silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. The night seemed to pause, holding its breath. It was as though the entire forest was waiting for something, waiting for the moment to snap. And then, with a suddenness that took both of them by surprise, a wolf's glowing eyes appeared in the shadows, just at the edge of the firelight. Its eyes were cold, predatory, locked onto them. "Get back," Ethan whispered urgently, his grip tightening on the branch. "Stay behind me." But Rachel's eyes were wide with terror. She could see the others now, their eyes appearing in the darkness. At least 6 wolves, perhaps more. They were spread out, forming a semicircle around the camp. The fire wasn't going to protect them for long. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. They were trapped. "Ethan," Rachel's voice was strained. "What do we do? We're surrounded." Ethan's mind raced. His survival instincts kicked in, but for the first time in years they felt inadequate. He wasn't just fighting the wilderness. He was fighting the unknown. And whatever these wolves were, they were no ordinary pack. He threw a glance at the fire. It was still roaring, but the wolves weren't retreating. They were waiting for something, circling slowly, testing the boundaries of the light. Ethan could sense that this wasn't just a hunt. It was a siege. The wolves were calculating, patient. "They're not attacking," Ethan muttered under his breath. His voice had a hint of disbelief. "They're testing us." Rachel's panic was growing. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving the wolves. "What do we do?" she repeated, louder this time. "Stay calm," Ethan ordered, though his voice betrayed his own rising tension. "Don't make any sudden moves. They're looking for weakness." But as he said this, the leader of the pack, the largest wolf with fur as dark as night, stepped closer, its low growl vibrating in the air. It was the kind of growl that made your spine tingle, a warning. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the weight of its gaze. Suddenly, one of the smaller wolves broke off from the group, sprinting directly towards them. Ethan reacted instinctively, swinging the branch down with all his strength. The wolf yelped, skidding to a halt just in time, its eyes filled with rage and hunger. It was fast, too fast, but it didn't retreat. It only circled back, tail low, watching them. Ethan's breathing became shallow, his mind focused. He could feel Rachel's fear radiating off of her, but he didn't have the luxury of being scared. The pack wasn't just here for a meal. They were here for something more, something darker. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the wolves began to close in. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice breaking, but Ethan shook his head firmly. "No," he said, "we're not running. That's exactly what they want us to do." The leader of the pack took another step closer, and Ethan could see the intelligence in its eyes. It wasn't like any wolf he had encountered before. It was as if it was waiting for something, as if it had been expecting them. Ethan gripped the branch tighter, his mind running through every possible escape, every strategy he could use to fight back. But he kept coming back to the same conclusion: the wolves were too many, too fast, too smart. There was no escape. Not unless they made a stand here, now. The firelight flickered again, casting a deep shadow over the wolves. One of the smaller wolves lunged forward suddenly, and Ethan swung his branch, knocking it back. The force of the blow sent it tumbling into the dirt, but the pack didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to close in tighter, more feral, their growls turning into a chorus of menace. Rachel backed away, her eyes never leaving the wolves. What do we do? They won't stop until... She was cut off by a terrifying howl from the leader, a long, eerie sound that sent chills down their spines. The wolves erupted into action, charging at the camp with deadly precision. Ethan's body moved on autopilot, swinging the branch with all his might, knocking one of the wolves back. But there were too many of them. The night was alive with chaos, the wolves' sharp teeth and glowing eyes surrounding them. The air crackled with the tension of impending disaster. Rachel's voice cut through the madness, trembling with fear. We have to get to the truck. We can't stay here. Ethan's heart sank as he realized that their only chance was to make a run for it. But the wolves were everywhere. They couldn't just run, they would be trapped. It was time to face their darkest fear. The fight for survival was no longer about the wolves. It was about whether Ethan and Rachel could escape the nightmare that was closing in on them. And even if they did, would they ever be the same again? The night was thick with unease, the stillness of the forest broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant, echoing howl of wolves. Each sound made Rachel jump, her heart pounding in her chest. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the trees, but the warmth it provided seemed to offer little comfort against the creeping cold in the air. Every part of her wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. Ethan was standing beside her, trying to remain calm, his eyes darting from one side of the camp to the other. The wolves were closer now, too close. They were no longer just watching from the edges of the firelight, but pacing in a slow, deliberate circle around the camp. The leader, its eyes glowing with an unnatural amber hue, stood just beyond the flickering shadows, staring at them intently. There was something almost human in its gaze, a knowing, predatory intelligence that sent chills down Rachel's spine. It didn't look like a normal wolf. "Ethan, they're not leaving," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are they just watching?" Ethan didn't answer at first. His eyes narrowed as he studied the wolves. He could feel his heart racing, his pulse quickening. His mind was working at full capacity, calculating their options, but every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. Wolves didn't behave like this. They didn't sit back and watch. They attacked. This felt more like a siege, like a trap was being laid. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't figure out what to do. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice strained. "But we can't let them get too close. Stay behind me." Rachel glanced back toward the truck, her stomach twisting in knots. It was too far away. If they made a run for it, they wouldn't make it. They were trapped here, in this tiny circle of firelight, surrounded by wolves that seemed to be getting bolder with each passing minute. Then, just as Rachel was about to say something else, the wind shifted. A sudden gust swept through the trees, and the fire flickered violently, casting the entire camp in darkness. For a split second, Rachel thought she saw movement in the shadows. Something large, something fast. But before she could react, the fire reignited with a loud crack, and the shadows took their form. The pack had moved closer, circling faster now. Their growls were low, menacing, like a constant hum vibrating through the ground. The hairs on Rachel's neck stood on end, and she could feel the fear wrapping around her chest, tightening its grip with every passing second. "Stay calm," Ethan said again, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed the panic inside him. "They won't attack unless we give them a reason." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, there was a loud crash from the bushes on the far side of the camp. Ethan spun around, clutching the branch, ready to defend them, but there was nothing there. Only the faint echo of something large moving in the underbrush. "It's them," Ethan said, his voice a strained whisper. "They're testing us. Rachel's eyes widened as she realized what he meant. The wolves weren't just circling them. They were trying to provoke them to see how they would react. The pack's movements had a rhythm, an unnatural precision to them, like they were toying with them, biding their time. Rachel's breath quickened. She turned to Ethan, her face pale. "What do we do? They're not leaving. We're stuck here." Ethan didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the fire, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to fight, but the wolves weren't like anything he had encountered before. He had been in tight spots before, had survived dangerous animals and hostile environments, but this felt different. There was a coldness in the air that made his skin crawl, a feeling of being watched, no, of being hunted. Another growl broke the silence, this time much closer than before. Ethan's body tensed, and he turned to Rachel, his jaw clenched. "If we're going to survive this, we need to stay calm. Stick to the fire. They can't get past it, not unless we give them a reason to." Rachel's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the fire pit. "And if they do? What if they charge?" Ethan didn't want to think about that. He didn't want to believe that they would be forced into a fight. But the closer the wolves came, the more likely it seemed. Then, a sound from the darkness made Ethan freeze. A faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Too quiet to be one of the wolves, yet too deliberate to be the wind. Something was watching them, something that wasn't a wolf. He could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. "I heard it, but we don't know what it is." A sudden movement caught his eye. A figure, cloaked in the shadows, darting between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be a person. He blinked, trying to focus, but it was gone. Gone into the woods, leaving only the faintest rustle behind. A wave of cold dread washed over him. The wolves weren't alone. "Ethan," Rachel whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What if we're not the only ones being hunted?" Ethan didn't answer, his mind racing. He had never felt this way before. Never felt so vulnerable, so helpless. And then, as though the night itself had heard their fears, the wind shifted once more. The trees groaned and creaked as if responding to some unseen force, and the pack of wolves moved, breaking their circle. But instead of retreating, they scattered, spreading out into the forest. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What are they doing? But before he could even finish his question, a low, guttural sound came from the far side of the camp. A new, unnatural noise that sent a shockwave of panic through Ethan's body. It wasn't the wolves. The sound was something else. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though something dark and ancient was drawing closer. The fire sputtered, its light weakening, casting long, monstrous shadows. Rachel gasped, her hand clenching around Ethan's arm. "What is that? What's happening?" Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together the mystery. The wolves had moved away, but they hadn't left. The true danger wasn't the pack. It was what they had been waiting for, what was lurking in the shadows. The something that wasn't an animal. A figure stepped from the woods, tall, dark, and almost human in shape. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and it moved with a slow, deliberate pace, as though it had been watching them all along. Rachel gasped, "Ethan, what is that?" Ethan's heart raced, and he knew the truth now. Whatever was in the woods with them wasn't just hunting them. It had been waiting for them. And as the figure drew closer, it became clear that the wolves were merely the beginning of something much worse. The air was thick with tension as the figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, and Ethan could feel a cold sweat running down his back. The wolves had disappeared into the shadows, but their growls still echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Ethan's grip tightened around the makeshift weapon he had found. Just a branch, but it felt heavier now, as if it was the only thing standing between them and whatever dark force was approaching. The figure continued to move forward, its glowing eyes piercing the night. Rachel stumbled backward, her breath shallow, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. The tall, dark shape was not fully human, nor was it entirely animal. Its limbs were elongated, its skin a mixture of darkened shadows and something more solid. The wolves had been waiting for this moment, but now it was clear they were not the true danger. The figure was, and it had no intention of leaving them alive. "Ethan, what is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his throat tight, "but we need to move. Now." The figure paused, standing perfectly still for a moment. Its eyes locked onto Ethan, and for a second, it almost felt like it was studying him. Ethan's breath hitched. This wasn't just some random creature. This thing was intelligent, it was aware, and it was in control. The wolves had been part of its plan, a distraction, a warning. Without another word, Ethan grabbed Rachel's hand, pulling her toward the truck. They had to get out of there. The creature stepped forward again, its movements quick and deliberate, blocking their path. "Stay back," Ethan shouted, brandishing the branch, trying to appear larger, stronger. But it was futile. The creature didn't flinch. It wasn't intimidated by their fear. It was feeding off it. Rachel gasped, pulling Ethan back. "Ethan, we can't fight that thing. We need to think." For the first time that night, Ethan's mind cleared. He could feel it, the primal, gut-wrenching fear that told him to run. But there was nowhere to run. This thing had already taken control of the night. He glanced around, searching for an escape. Then it hit him. The fire. The flames were low, flickering weakly in the growing darkness. It had provided some protection earlier, but now it seemed too weak. Ethan turned to Rachel. "Get the lighter. We need to reignite the fire, make it bigger. We can use it to drive it back." Rachel hesitated, but there was no time to waste. She sprinted toward the pack of supplies they had brought, her hands fumbling as she grabbed the lighter and sparked it to life. The small flame caught, growing quickly into a blazing fire. Ethan grabbed a handful of dry wood, throwing it onto the flames. The fire roared to life, illuminating the clearing with an intense glow. The creature hissed, recoiling as the flames reached higher, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow more enraged. Its eyes blazed brighter, and the air around them grew colder, the forest seemingly closing in. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't afford to hesitate now. "Rachel, keep the fire going. We need to push it back." She nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. As she fed the fire, Ethan grabbed another branch, holding it like a spear. The creature stared at him with that unnerving, almost knowing gaze. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, moving faster than Ethan could react. Everything happened in a blur. Ethan thrust the branch forward, just as the creature reached for him. The end of the stick hit its chest with a sickening thud. But it didn't stop. The creature grabbed the branch, twisting it out of Ethan's hands with a strength that left him breathless. It bared its teeth, its snarls echoing in the night, but Ethan had no time to be afraid. The fire was their only hope. With every ounce of strength, he shoved his hands into the pile of wood and kicked the remaining logs into the flames, causing them to flare up with a crackling roar. The creature screeched, taking a step back, its form flickering in and out like a mirage, as if the fire was weakening it. It let out one final terrifying howl, a sound that would haunt Ethan and Rachel for the rest of their lives. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature retreated into the shadows, vanishing into the night like a nightmare fading at dawn. The wolves, no longer under its command, scattered into the woods, their eerie howls fading away as the forest returned to its uneasy silence. Rachel's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, her body shaking with exhaustion. Ethan stood beside her, his chest heaving as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The fire continued to crackle, but now it felt like a mere flicker compared to the overwhelming darkness they had just faced. We did it," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, still in shock. "But what was that? What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," Rachel said, her voice hoarse. "But we're alive. We made it." Ethan looked up at the night sky, the stars now visible again through the thinning clouds. The forest felt quieter, as though the very air had been holding its breath. But even though the immediate danger had passed, neither of them could shake the feeling that something more was lurking in the dark, waiting for the next moment of weakness. As they sat by the fire, staring into its embers, the world seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. But they both knew that their lives had changed forever. The terror they had faced, the darkness they had survived, would stay with them forever. There were forces in the world far beyond their understanding, and tonight, they had only just scratched the surface. The night was over, but the fear, the uncertainty, and the mystery remained. And as the fire burned low, Rachel and Ethan couldn't help but wonder, had they truly escaped, or had something much darker just begun? As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Ethan and Rachel sat silently by the now dying embers of the fire. The night had been long, and the terror they had faced seemed almost unreal, like a nightmare they would wake up from any moment. But this wasn't a dream. The creatures, the wolves, the eerie presence in the darkness, they were all too real. Their hearts still raced with the adrenaline of the past few hours, yet a quiet unease lingered in the air. The forest, once full of life and sound, now felt empty, as if it had never truly been alive at all. Ethan glanced over at Rachel, her face pale and drawn, but there was a strength in her eyes now, a silent acknowledgement of what they had survived. They had faced something unimaginable, something that defied logic and reason. And yet they had made it out. They had fought back, and against all odds they had lived. "We're alive," Rachel murmured, breaking the silence, her voice soft, as if she were still unsure of the reality they were in. "I keep thinking about it. How did we survive? How did we make it through that?" Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't have the answers. He didn't understand what had happened, but one thing was clear. They had learned something that night. They had learned the true depths of fear, and in doing so, they had discovered a strength they never knew they had. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice rough, "but I do know this: we can't take anything for granted anymore. We don't know what's out there in the dark, what's real and what's not. It changes you, Rachel. All of it. Everything." Rachel nodded slowly, her gaze distant. She understood. They had ventured into the unknown, lured by curiosity, by the promise of adventure, and they had come face to face with the unimaginable. And yet, despite everything, they had survived. But at what cost? As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the forest, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the terror they had faced wasn't over. The creatures, they weren't just a fluke, a random encounter in the night. There was something far deeper at play, something darker hiding just beneath the surface. "Do you think it's over?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Do you think we really got away?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning the empty woods around them. His mind was still reeling from the events of the night, but one thing was clear. The danger might have passed, but the mystery remained. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think whatever it was, it's still out there, watching." And with that, a silence fell between them, not one of peace, but of contemplation. The night had changed them. It had shown them just how fragile they were, how quickly the world around them could spiral into chaos, and how even in the darkest of moments, there could be a flicker of hope. But as they walked away from the fire, from the danger that had once seemed so real, they couldn't help but wonder, was this the end? Or had they simply stumbled upon the beginning of something much darker? The answers were elusive, lost in the shadows of the forest, and perhaps they would never fully understand. But one thing was certain: the world was far more mysterious and dangerous than they had ever known. And now, the question wasn't if they had escaped, but whether they would ever truly be free from the terror they had faced. As they walked into the morning light, the weight of the unknown pressed down on them, an unspoken reminder that the world held secrets, some of which were meant to stay hidden, lurking just beyond the edge of understanding. And that, perhaps, was the scariest truth of all. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more eerie stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think happened to Ethan and Rachel after they escaped? Share your predictions or any theories you have in the comments below. And if you're brave enough, share this video with friends who enjoy a good thrill. Stay tuned for even more terrifying stories and mysteries in the upcoming videos. Join our community of thrill seekers and be the first to know when the next heart-pounding adventure drops.